Singapore, a thriving multicultural world city, an Asian tiger playing a key role on the world stage. But just below the surface of this former British colony lies a history of foreign invasion, smouldering racial tension, and violent struggle against imperial power. After more than 100 years of colonial rule, in 1941, faith in the British Empire was shaken when Japan bombed Singapore.
It was the next morning when I went up to my room, and that's what I discovered. The shrapnel right in the middle of my pillow where my head would have been.
A brutal campaign began to expel the white colonials from Asia.
The Japanese despised the Anglo-Saxon powers that had occupied most of Asia. The propaganda at the time is all about ridding Asia of the white man.
British Empire forces were plunged into war in Southeast Asia, fighting a determined enemy in the unfamiliar jungles of Malaya and Singapore. The invasion unleashed an explosion of social conflict amongst the Chinese, Malay and Indian communities who resented British rule.
The coming of the Japanese presented a very good opportunity for them to get independence.
It was a call to arms that echoed within the ranks of the British Army, causing 20,000 British Indian Army soldiers to switch sides and fight for the Japanese.
When those men at the end of the war go back to India, they're hailed as national heroes because they fought against an imperial power.
Singapore, the bastion of the British Empire, fell in just 70 days. It was Japan's greatest victory and Britain's most humiliating defeat of World War II. The fall of Singapore changed the face of Southeast Asia forever and heralded the beginning of the end of the British Empire. In the early 20th century, the bustling trading port of Singapore and the fertile Malay Peninsula to its north were the jewels in the crown of Britain's East Asian colonies.
The existence of Singapore really underlines the power of the empire. This is a place where in 1820 it was a fishing village. By 1920 it's the biggest commercial city in Asia. It's the clearinghouse for wares from all over the East heading back to Europe. It's a massive commercial success.
To power the colonial economy, the British brought Chinese and Indian workers into the predominantly Malay community, creating an undercurrent of ethnic tension.
Both Chinese and Indians, they formed the biggest racial groups within the country. And the Malays are not very happy about this. They're really not very happy with what the British have done for allowing the unrestricted entry of Chinese, especially Chinese, into the country.
But the British colonial ruling class were largely oblivious to the tensions around them as they revelled in the prestige and privilege of empire.
Well, we look up to them and we call them the big masters, and they call us natives.
Well, the British colonials, of course, they're a breed apart. They think they're very superior because they had servants to look after them. The women did nothing during the day except just go out to chatter.
Local people weren't allowed in their clubs. Natives had to travel in different compartments on trains. They behaved so much as if all this was the natural order of things that they were brilliantly successful in maintaining this illusion for a very, very long time.
Britain was not the only colonial power in Southeast Asia. The Netherlands, France and America were also plundering the riches of the Orient. But there was one Asian country that had its own imperialist ambitions and saw itself in direct competition with the West: Japan.
Japan felt that it had a destiny to have an empire in Asia. And when it looked around and it saw all these European empires in Asia, it thought, why not us? It saw racism, condescension of a kind that proud Japanese imperialists, and especially proud Japanese soldiers, found intolerable.
In 1931, Japan made its move. Short of raw materials, it invaded Manchuria. The poorly equipped and badly led Chinese were no match for the modern, powerful Japanese army, who eventually overran nearly a third of China. In 1936, Japan moved closer to all-out war when it signed an alliance with Nazi Germany. They sent rising general Tomoyuki Yamashita to meet with leaders of the Third Reich to learn of the German plans for making war. Those plans became brutally clear 3 years later, on September the 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and the world was plunged into war. With the war expanding, Britain's dominions from around the world rallied to the defense of the mother country. British feared that if Japan entered the war on Germany's side, it would attack Singapore. As a deterrent, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a multinational force of British and Indian troops to strengthen the island's defences. The Gordon Highlanders and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders were among the first British troops to arrive.
We'd waited 3 weeks because of a tremendous snowstorm. When we actually arrived, the heat was so oppressive. We just wondered just what we were coming to. Going through the old Singapore with the Chinese sitting, smoking their pipes and playing mahjong, and the smell of the villages was something you'd never experienced before.
The Argylls were the next generation of the ferocious kilted soldiers from World War I that the Germans nicknamed Ladies from Hell. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart.
He was my CO. He used to call him Busty. He was a thin fella. He didn't say much.
He was quite a hard man in many ways, but he wanted his battalion to be the best one there was, and made this feeling go into all the men there.
The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders had come from the harsh cold of the Scottish winter. They'd no idea how to fight in the tropics. Stewart led them deep into the steamy jungles of Malaya on rigorous training exercises.
In jungle warfare, it is the quality of the men far more than the quality of the weapons that counts.
Before I went there, the normal sort of weapons training and that sort of thing had been done. But after that, I was taken to the jungle, and we had to deal with the other problems that arise. The jungle is neutral, but you've got to live in it. You suddenly find your legs are covered in leeches. How do you deal with it?
In September 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging, the Japanese rolled into French Indochina, just to the north of Malaya. The French gave up without a fight. The first of the colonial dominoes had fallen. The Singapore fortress needed to be bolstered. Australia's response was emphatic. In February 1941, it sent the first wave of 10,000 troops to join their British allies in Singapore.
Well, it was supposed to be secret, and there must have been 5,000 people there. And we went like first-class passengers. Great way to go to war.
With the war in Europe a long way away, the mood in Singapore was relaxed. The young men of the British Empire forces quickly awakened to the delights of Singapore. While Commonwealth troops happily rubbed shoulders with the locals and absorbed Asian culture, They were being fed virulent anti-Japanese propaganda, designed to convince the troops that the Japanese were racially inferior and would pose no real threat.
That was the first thing they said. They all wear glasses, they can't see.
Oh, yeah, intelligence officer came round and said, oh, they only shoot with .25 guns, like a pea rifle.
We were told that they were short-sighted, they wouldn't fight of the night.
That they were useless buggers, that one Australian was worth 10 Japanese.
At its most shocking, it cast the Japanese people as subhuman, as monkeys, as baboons, as Churchill described them, yellow dwarves.
We found out how good they were.
In May 1941, with Japan on the brink of war, the British sent Lieutenant General Arthur Percival to Singapore to command the assortment of multinational empire forces. His appointment gave the first inkling that Singapore was not a British priority.
Because the British were then prioritising the campaigns in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, they sent their best, or at least bad, generals there. And Malaya was bottom of the queue for good commanders, as it was bottom of the queue for anything else. But Percival was a pretty poor specimen.
While Percival was coming to grips with the task of defending Malaya and Singapore, his Japanese counterpart, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, was in southern China drawing up his battle plans for an invasion of the British colonies. Contrary to British propaganda, he was accomplished and battle-hardened.
見かけはすごく強直な武骨な将軍のように見えますけれども、科学にも強くて、そして作戦も合理的なんですが、多少その情に脆いという面があって。
Yamashita was probably the best Japanese general of the war. Very tough, very experienced, very clear-sighted. Yamashita was in a completely different class from Percival. The idea of putting them in the ring together, I mean, it was ludicrous.
On December the 4th, British signals intelligence intercepted Japanese orders. The Imperial Army was heading towards northwestern Malaya. Percival scrambled his forces at Kota Baru. With few British troops available, the defence of the coastline was left to the 8th Indian Brigade.
Action front!
The Indians had fought loyally alongside the British for generations and were expected to hold the line. On December the 6th, an Australian Air Force bomber flying out of Kota Baru spotted a large Japanese fleet steaming towards the coast.
で、12月の8日の午前2時に、上陸命令で終点に飛び乗りまして、コタバラ海岸に前進したのがおそらく夜明け前でしたから。
On the 8th of December 1941, Japan entered World War II when it sent an invasion force of 25,000 men to attack the British colony of Malaya. 5,500 went straight at the Indian troops at Kota Baru.
After から向こうから統治下ですかね、あれからどんどん撃ってきた人ですけど、もうあっちこっちの飛んできたです。もう海岸の小樽の砂浜を鉄棒で持ってもそれで今度掘って隠れてですね。
The Japanese made simultaneous landings on undefended beaches in Thailand and advanced quickly towards the Malay border. But at Kota Baru, the battle raged. The 5,000-strong Indian force took the brunt of the attack. At first, under the British officers, they put up a stubborn fight.
私のは約14名の兵隊が小隊長が負傷して こちらが銃眼に手榴弾を投げ込んで沈黙させて。
A second wave of Japanese swept ashore, and the Indians were overrun. General Yamashita had successfully landed his invasion force. As the Japanese army was taking Kota Baru, their air force was en route to the American naval base in Hawaii. They inflicted a crippling preemptive strike on the American fleet moored in Pearl Harbor. 3 hours later, a second wave of bombers headed for an unsuspecting Singapore. There was no blackout, and the streets were brightly lit, allowing the Japanese pilots to easily find their targets.
実に綺麗なネオンサインでね、あそこ爆撃、南から入ったからね、南に下がって北へ向かって進路、シンガポールの街ね、市街に。
I was sleeping, and at about 4:30, I suddenly woke up because the house vibrated.
We had a lot of siren warning going on and off, and we didn't care very much about it, you see. I was observing there was a small black dot right very far above the sky.
The Japanese bombing raid on Singapore delivered the alarming message to the island's citizens that their colonial masters could not keep them safe. With the American fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor, the only Allied warships in the region were the Prince of Wales and the Repulse in Singapore Naval Base. On the 8th of December, the two ships with 4 destroyers left Singapore Harbour to support the embattled British Empire troops in northern Malaya. 2 days later, they were sighted by Japanese bombers. Without air cover, this tiny fleet was fatally exposed.
船の防御の体制がね、非常に巧みなんだね。きっと僕は想像するんだけどね、環境からこう見ておってね、望遠鏡で見ておって、そして爆弾を落とすでしょ。落とした瞬間がパッと目に浮かんだ時にフワッとこう。ところがね、特殊化爆撃士という人はこの上域だったらどの辺の角度で曲がってるってことを読んじゃうんだね。
I can still remember the ship bouncing when the bombs and the torpedoes hit us.
それは綺麗だった。すごい綺麗だったっていうこともうそれはね、やったっていう感じだったね。
I still remember going down a rope 10 feet down and catching my foot in one of the portholes. And with that, I just sort of give a heave and let go and drop the 60 foot straight into the water.
In less than 3 hours, 1,000 British sailors had perished. Early next morning, Prime Minister Churchill was informed that for the first time in history, ships of the Royal Navy had been sent to the bottom by the supposedly inferior Japanese.
The full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. Over all this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we, everywhere, were weak and naked.
As the Japanese army pushed deeper into Malaya, in village after village they were welcomed as liberators by indigenous Malays. Feeling overrun by the large numbers of Chinese and Indians brought in by the British, they saw the Japanese invasion as their chance to regain control of their country.
To them, the coming of the Japanese present a very good opportunity. They have the impression that the Japanese will come and deliver freedom from British colonialism.
Before the war, there had been a growing independence movement among Malays, but the British had arrested and imprisoned the leaders.
They were trying to end British colonialism in Malaya, to bring Malaya as an independent nation, even if this means collaborating or working with the Japanese.
These men were now freed, and increasingly, many local Malays began to help the Japanese.
線路の上言いますか、あれを胴体のこともあるんで、車がだいぶ傷んでおりました。それで整備するのにね、整備しようりゃどういうか兵隊じゃないですが、地方の人が来るんですね。
To encourage their Asian neighbours to join the fight against European colonialism, the Japanese promoted their vision, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
いや、日本の大東亜共栄圏構想というのはとにかく、日本を一応リーダーとするけれども、全てのアジア人が仲良く暮らそうと。資源を分かち合うし、それから政治発言権も仲良く分かち合いましょうという。
Anti-British propaganda quickly spread the message.
The Japanese were remarkably successful in persuading Southeast Asian nations that there was a place for them, an honoured place for them, in Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, in which they would have rights, in which they would have their own governments, in which they would be treated with a respect that was denied to them by the European powers.
As well as persuading the Malays of their common interests, the Japanese had set up a spy network before the war. There'd been a sizable Japanese community living in Singapore and Malaya for years, and many had been feeding information back to their homeland.
During the weekends, the Japanese barbers, dentists, doctors, all will go to the countryside, saying they were visiting the Malaysian countryside, not knowing they are really photographing all the shortcuts. So much so, when they attacked our country, they are using bicycles to bypass the British who are waiting on the main roads.
The bicycle brigades were a vital asset of the Japanese army, and the routes were planned long before they invaded, using information supplied by Japanese spy networks. With the Japanese now in Malaya, the British rooted out the spies and dealt with them brutally.
Oh, you wouldn't believe no matter where you turned, spies. Japanese planned them there. Our hairdresser was a spy. People go up there and have a haircut and say so-and-so, 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 and he 2 seconds, the Japanese knew about it. So they shot him. On the spot, bang. See you later.
By the 11th of December 1941, the Japanese advancing from Singora in Thailand had reached Jitra in northern Malaya. Here they came face to face with a large empire force of mainly Indian troops. Many of the Indians were poorly trained, and the Japanese had little regard for them.
The Japanese invaded Malaya already assuming that the Indian army would not put up much of a fight. They took a rather contemptuous attitude towards it on the grounds that it was a servile army, therefore it probably wouldn't be very efficient.
They broke through the Indian regiments, and there was casualties flying in all directions. And that forced the powers that be to pull us back out of there. Otherwise, the Japs got across there, we would have been cut off in the first week.
Fire. But the unexpected potency of the Japanese soldiers was only partly to blame. Something was eating away at their resolve, and it had its roots in their homeland. Seeds of anti-British dissent had been growing in India for decades under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi. With the rise of the Indian independence movement, Britain's hold on imperial power was becoming tenuous.
It was a pretty scary reality for the British that for much of the Second World War they had to deploy 50 battalions of infantry for internal security duties in India. Many Indian nationalists were on record then as saying, why should we be asked to fight for freedom when that freedom is being denied to us?
Nearly 3,000 British Indian Army soldiers surrendered at Jitra. The Japanese, aware of the growing discontent, believed they could persuade them to change sides and fight against the British. Intelligence officer Fujiwara Iwachi targeted one of their leaders, Captain Mohan Singh.
Mohan was a die-hard anti-imperialist who wanted to drive the British out of India as soon as possible by whatever means available.
If you surrender, Fujiwara begins to share his ideas that maybe we can set up some kind of force. Maybe, if you get the Indian troops to move away from fighting the Japanese, and this is where really some notion of it, the Indian National Army begins to form.
Rise and win freedom. Singh agreed to become commander of this new Indian National Army and help recruit amongst his fellow Indian soldiers from those who the Japanese were able to capture in Malaya.
Mohan Singh chose the flag of the Indian independence movement for his new revolutionary army that would fight alongside the Japanese, flying colours that would one day become the national flag of India. As they moved southward, the Japanese captured British airfields and destroyed aircraft. With total freedom in the air, Japanese bombers headed for the island of Penang. Penang was home to a population of mainly Chinese and Eurasians who'd been born and bred on the island and were fiercely loyal to the crown. On the 11th of December, 41 Japanese bombers blasted the island, and the British could do nothing.
Oh, terrible. Incredible. Nearly 2,000 casualties in the first day of bombing and the other days that followed. There were dead bodies, so what we could pick up, we picked up. That was really the beginning of the bombing of Penang. Ruthless bombing.
After 4 days of constant bombing, with Japanese forces advancing, Penang's local commanders gave the order to evacuate white women and children and British military personnel.
All the Europeans got out. They were all panic-stricken, there's no doubt about it. Absolutely panic-stricken. They started running and didn't stop running, if I may tell you that. Evacuation was very, very fast.
Halt! Some local Eurasians also tried to escape.
When I went to the jetty, I think the last ferry that was going across, I was stopped. So I went up, the ferry was half empty. I said, can I go across? No, no, no.
You're not British.
You're not British. You can't go across.
The British very quickly made it plain that escape was something that was reserved for white people. That what happened to Malayan people or Chinese people or Indian people, the British, by their actions, showed they simply did not care. And this destroyed, in a matter of weeks, centuries of instinctive respect by colonial subjects towards the British imperial power, and so it deserved it.
On December the 17th, 1941, after more than a century of British colonial rule, Penang fell unopposed to the Japanese. In their haste, the British left behind a functioning radio station. The Japanese soon had Radio Penang back on air, feeding propaganda to Singapore.
Hello Singapore, this is Radio Penang calling. How do you like our bombing?
As the British withdrew through the ravaged Malayan countryside, stunned locals tried to comprehend the sight of British Empire soldiers on the run from an Asian army.
We saw troops moving, British troops going in the north. And less than a week later, we saw them returning the other way, going back south. They stopped their van and asked for water to drink. Their beards were not shaven, and then we knew something was wrong.
They looked weary, they were bloodstained, they were dirty. They're like warriors from another world to me. But they were splattered with mud, and they wanted some food.
As his army took flight, General Percival was forced to abandon headquarters, supplies, ammunition and equipment. He was struggling to counter the speed of the Japanese onslaught. In just over 3 weeks, General Yamashita had captured all of northern Malaya. By the end of 1941, the battle reached Kampar, where the Royal Artillery made a stand.
Oh, the artillery was so powerful, we were evacuated to the hills. My father used to bring some cotton wool and stuff into the ears. The whole ground was shaking. For 4 days and 4 nights, my God, how many thousand rounds were fired?
We were in there as a regiment. We was roughly over 24 guns there, and we were just pelting at them. It was New Year's Eve. Our colonel says, right boys, get them out. And every shell that went into the breech of every gun, I did it. Happy New Year to you, And every gun fired 5 rounds, rapid fire, open sights. And you could just see them flying through the air like little bits of butterflies.
The Royal Artillery delayed the Japanese at Kampar for 4 days before they were encircled by Japanese troops and forced to retreat. By the 7th of January 1942, the Japanese reached Slim River, less than 300 miles from Singapore. Here, they launched a heavy attack on the British Empire forces. A tank column broke through the defending Indian troops. The Argylls were the last line of defence.
I was sent forward to find out what was happening. Suddenly, my platoon sergeant, who's in the rear, said, "Come back at once."
Get back!
And I fell into this ditch with the sergeant who'd been beside me. I said, "I'm afraid I've been hit." And he said, "So have I." And with that, they started shooting us like mad. Everyone missed me, but I was actually pouring with blood. I could see the blood pouring out, jets pouring out of my arm. So I picked up some mud from the bottom of the ditch and made a sort of poultice over it. I think I must have passed out a bit, but when I recovered, nobody was near me at all. So I nipped out of the ditch and ran for the jungle for several weeks. Eventually, I met a group of Indian soldiers, but the Japanese came across a paddy field and saw us there, and there was nothing we could do. So we had to hold up our hands and say, "We surrender."
At battle's end, there were less than 100 Argylls who hadn't been killed or captured. They acted as a rearguard for the defeated British and Indian troops who were making their way southwards, abandoning the capital of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. Along with the troops, civilians fled in the thousands towards the sanctuary of Singapore, just 3 days' march away.
There were a lot of refugees, Europeans, there were Chinese, Indians. Everybody was getting out. People were rushing away, and we couldn't find a carriage. And the train was starting to move, so Dad said, "Jump onto the fender behind the engine." So there we were, hanging on for dear life. My father's arm around, one arm around me, my face buried in his neck. eyes closed, praying that we wouldn't fall off. I was scared. I was really scared. I didn't know what was going on. It was dark. The shadows of the trees looked pretty ghostly. The thought in everybody's mind was that Singapore was the place to be, where you would be safe. Ah, how wrong we were.
By mid-January 1942, Yamashita's army had reached the southern Malayan states of Johor, just 2 days' march from Singapore. Here, they faced Australian troops in combat for the first time. The Australians, still believing the Japanese to be inferior, were full of confidence and expected to stop them in their tracks. The commander of the 10,000 Australian troops, Major General Gordon Bennett, had made his reputation in World War I as a fearless frontline soldier. For the Australians, one of the few small victories in the Malayan Campaign unfolded on the peninsula's west coast, near the Muar River. On the 15th of January, the Japanese launched an attack on 4,000 untried Indian troops Bennett had positioned there.
Now the Indians were very much all young men, untrained, and they just went through them like butter.
When Bennett got word, he rushed 2,000 Australian reinforcements to Muar to back up the Indians. In what was one of the few Japanese mistakes in the campaign, they sent a tank column straight down the main road towards the Australians. Japanese tanks had proved decisive in the campaign because the British brought none, thinking they would be ineffective in the jungles. But on a bend in the road, the tanks ran into 2 Australian anti-tank guns.
The anti-tank inflicted heavy casualties on their tanks. They took them out. One went up in smoke, the other one started to circle round and they got it.
Our 2 guns knocked out the 8 tanks and they immediately rushed us up to the front line. So when I got there and our gun was set up, the tanks were still on fire.
All the ammunition, the small arms ammunition that they had started to go off, and then the smell of hamburgers. That was the crew of the tank being burnt.
Oh, they'd all been killed, either killed in the tank or some had got out of the tanks and the infantry had shot them.
War is a terrible, stinking, horrible, shocking state of affairs. You are asked to kill a man you've never met, and if you don't kill him, he'll kill you. And we're in the middle of a battle, and this is the result of the battle.
As the battle for Muar wore on, the Japanese sent 5,000 troops to outflank the Australians.
We realised we had been cut off, so the order was given to withdraw, so we withdrew down the road to a place called Parrot Salon. Unfortunately, the Japanese got there first and they had heavily fortified the bridge.
We are running out of supplies.
Our Lieutenant Colonel Charles Anderson, seeing that the situation was hopeless, ordered every man for himself.
Anderson made the painful decision to abandon the most seriously wounded, assuming they would be cared for. 115 Australians and 35 Indians were left behind on the bridge. The Japanese moved them from the road to behind this building.
They were all wounded, some very badly, and we were hoping that they'd be treated humanely. The Japanese shot or bayoneted them, poured petrol over them, and set them on fire.
いやこれは日本にとってみればですね、死体を焼くというのは死者に対する礼を尽くしたということになるんですね。かえって日本では土葬にするということは死体を物扱いしたということで、かえってそれは悪いことだと考えられています。
My views of what they did, the Japanese, it was an act of war.
We did the same in similar situations. Up towards Muir, the Japanese wounded there, they were lying in a trench, but they were also about to pull out pins of grenades and blast the advancing troops with them. Our men were told to kill them, shoot them. We were shooting their wounded, and when we got back to the bridge, the Japanese shot our wounded because what could they do with them?
In just 55 days, the Japanese Imperial Army had pushed the British Empire forces over 600 miles southward down the Malay Peninsula. They'd killed or captured over 20,000 Empire troops and were within striking distance of Singapore. On the 27th of January 1942, Percival received a signal from High Command permitting him to withdraw to Singapore Island. Most of the surviving units managed to scramble across the causeway connecting the island to the mainland. The last to cross were the Royal Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. As an act of defiance and inspiration to their Empire comrades, they piped themselves across.
They struck up the pipes and we were going across the causeway into Singapore itself. And the tunes that was getting played, Highland Laddie, where have you been all the day, Highland Laddie, bonny laddie? I don't know much more. And once these drums get up and the pipes are playing and oh, there's something.
That kind of defiant, in-your-face gesture on the part of the Argylls, that sort of stiff upper lip, well, that's the response to adversity that wins you empires, right? And it's the kind of response to adversity that an empire at bay, backed into a corner, would be prone to show. Fighting spirit. We're not done yet. Come and get us.
And so it had come. The prized British colony of Malaya had fallen, and over 1 million people were bailed up in the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore. As the Japanese prepared to lay siege to the island, the realization dawned. If Singapore were to fall, the British Empire could fall with it, and Southeast Asia would never be the same again.